Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to dive into how the cold, hard logic of game theory can help us make sense of the chaotic, high-stakes world of international diplomacy. Okay, so let's jump right in. We usually think of international relations as, well, unpredictable, right? It's this big, messy dance driven by powerful personalities, national pride, and a whole lot of hidden motives. And that leads to a huge question. It's the real puzzle here. How in the world can we find any logic in these massive negotiations, whether it's a trade deal or something that brings us to the terrifying brink of war? But what if there's a way to cut through all that noise? Well, political scientist Barry O'Neill argues that game theory gives us a really powerful lens to do just that. It's not about finding some simple answer, but about giving us a framework to even begin to understand what's going on. So how does this actually work in practice? Well, what game theory models do is they kind of boil down these incredibly complex interactions into their strategic core. It gives us a much clearer picture of what's really happening under the surface. So what is game theory really? At its heart, it's the study of strategic decision-making. Now, it's not a crystal ball that can't predict the future. What it can do is map out the incentives, the possible moves, and the likely outcomes when you have rational players whose fates are all tied together. You see a classic scenario all the time in diplomacy. It's called offer, counteroffer, bargaining. The idea is really simple. Time is money. A deal today is almost always better than the same deal tomorrow. So that ticking clock puts pressure on everyone to find an agreement, and fast. And there's this fantastic, if a little absurd story that really drives this point home. The big lesson here is that the person whose time is less valuable, the one who can afford to wait longer, they've got the power. In diplomacy, the nation that can withstand a long stalemate usually has the upper hand. Okay, so patience is key in a back-and-forth bargain. But what happens when both sides have to make their move at the same time? This is where things get really interesting, because it brings us to a much more famous model, the prisoner's dilemma. It shows how a totally irrational outcome, like a dangerous arms race, can actually come from two countries making what seem like perfectly logical choices. Okay, take a look at this. Let's walk through it from State I's point of view. If State I stops arming, my best move is to keep arming so I get an advantage. And if State I keeps arming, my best move is to keep arming so I don't get left behind. State I is thinking the exact same thing, and that's the kicker. The most logical choice for each of them individually leads them both to that bottom right box, a costly, dangerous arms race, even though they would both be better off in the top left. But, and this is a huge but, all of these powerful models hinge on one critical assumption, that leaders are perfectly rational. And, well, that's a bit shaky. I mean, really? Do decision makers always act like cold, calculating supercomputers, just maximizing their country's interests? Or are they, human? You see, the classic theory assumes that leaders are hyper-rational, that they have all the information and always make the absolute best choice. But we all know real life is just way, way messier than that. Real leaders are working with limited information, and they're influenced by all sorts of powerful and very human feelings. You've got things like honor and national prestige, and these aren't just fluffy concepts, they're real strategic factors. Then you have what are called audience costs. That's the political heat a leader takes at home if they back down. Leaders also rely on their gut, on intuition. And get this, they don't always look for the perfect solution. A lot of the time they satisfies, which just means they pick the first option that's good enough to get the job done. So if these models are built on this imperfect idea of rationality, you have to ask, what good are they in the real world? And this is where it gets really clever. Maybe the best way to use these models isn't to predict what's going to happen, but to bring them right inside the negotiation itself. The goal isn't to find the answer, but to use the model as a tool to help everyone find a path forward, together. Let's look at a perfect real-world case, the Third UN Conference on the Law of the Sea. You had over 150 countries just stuck for years, totally deadlocked over this super complicated and emotional issue of deep-sea mining. So why were they stuck? Well, first off, there was zero trust between the developed and developing nations. The economics were a giant question mark, and everybody had their own data, their own facts, and they were basically using them as weapons against each other. Compromise? It was impossible. So how do you break a deadlock like that? You bring in a neutral referee. And in this case, the referee was a transparent computer model of mining economics, built by a team at MIT. The whole point was to get everyone to stop arguing about whose numbers were right and create a shared, objective starting point that everyone could actually trust. And the guy leading the talks, Ambassador Tommy Koh, he got it. He knew the model wasn't going to spit out some magic solution. The point was to build trust by getting everyone on the same page, literally, and creating some common ground. And you know what? It actually worked. The model became this common knowledge base. Suddenly, they weren't fighting over competing facts anymore. They were actually talking about policy, about compromise. It completely changed the game from a nasty competition to a real collaboration. And they finally reached an agreement. So in the end, game theory isn't some magic bullet that replaces diplomacy. It's better to think of it as a powerful tool for diplomacy, a way to structure our thinking, test our assumptions, and maybe, just maybe, find a path to agreement that we couldn't see before. Which leaves us with one last thing to think about. In a world full of complex human beings, can a model ever truly capture the art of diplomacy?